Hello and welcome to this webinar on permanent establishment risk in the UK. My name is Ben Aspinall. I'm a partner at Ecovis Wingrave Yeats. We're the UK member firm of Ecovis International, a network of like-minded firms in just over 90 countries. We're based in London in the UK, and a lot of our work is focused on helping overseas businesses enter the UK market. We're a firm of accountants, auditors, tax advisors. Within the wider network, we have corporate finance specialists, M&A, and legal advisors. The recording today is for Enterprise Ireland, with whom we've been working for a good number of years, advising their clients on making that leap from Ireland into the UK. And today, the subject we're going to cover is permanent establishment risk. So what that means when you may have a permanent establishment, when you may not have a permanent establishment, what the implications are for perhaps having a PE, a permanent establishment, but not realising, and what are the kind of red flags? So what do you need to know that may lead you to seek some further advice or just have an initial conversation. My details are at the end of this recording, and if you do want to have a free, no obligations chat, you're welcome to get in touch or perhaps speak to your Enterprise Ireland account manager, who would be happy to put you in touch with the right person here at Ecovis for whatever your query is with regards to sort of making that leap into the UK. So going on to the first slide. This is what we're going to cover today. So as discussed, what is a permanent establishment, what is not a permanent establishment, or at least what may not necessarily be a permanent establishment, why it matters, so again what the implications are, and then those red flags to round it off. So first things first, the permanent establishment, the first trigger, really the sort of most obvious one, is a fixed place of business. So this we'll talk about a little bit more on the next slide, because it's probably the most common one, the easiest one to avoid, and also the most common one that will trigger the permanent establishment. Some construction projects, and I say some, and it could be installation as well as a construction or supervisory project. Not all will trigger a permanent establishment, but some will. That does depend on the nature of the project and the length of the project. The agency point here, agency permanent establishment. So this happens when you have a third party boots on the ground in the UK, but you have endowed them with the authority to conclude business contracts, take significant business decisions on your behalf. They may be triggering a permanent establishment risk for you, even though you have perhaps used the agent to mitigate those risks. So it is worth considering what they're doing, discuss that with an advisor, and make sure that it is all work of a nature that wouldn't trigger a permanent establishment. And then finally, one that's becoming perhaps a little more common these days is the virtual permanent establishment, which probably the most common point here is if you're hosting, if you have your own server in the UK, which you own and operate, and that hosts significant business activity, i.e. not static files and backups, but it's core business, day-to-day business going through that server that you hold. So, as I mentioned on the previous slide, the fixed place of business is the most common one, which will trigger a permanent establishment. So this will be typically offices, factories, some construction sites. As mentioned, not all will trigger that permanent establishment, but some will. So it is definitely, I think, if you're going into construction, installation, supervisory projects, anything like that, discuss it with an advisor first, because it can get messy if you don't and you think that you've avoided a permanent establishment, but actually you haven't. And then fundamentally, the key one is where your management is. So even if you don't have offices, factories, etc., or a construction site, if management are on the ground in the UK making business decisions, running the business from the UK, or running the UK part of the business from the UK, then you very likely have a permanent establishment. So it is worth considering what the role of management is when they're in the UK and when they may be triggering that risk. So what's not a permanent establishment? Now this isn't a list of what absolutely is categorically not a permanent establishment, but these are things which may not trigger the permanent establishment in the UK. So having employees, having boots on the ground, and that may include contractors or agents as well. That doesn't necessarily mean you have a permanent establishment. Again, it comes down to what are they doing? Are they conducting concluding contracts in the UK? Are they making management decisions? Are they running for all intents and purposes, are they running the business? Are they managing the business from the UK? So it can be a little nuanced, but essentially, you might see that if you have a sales and marketing lead in the UK who isn't actually delivering anything, isn't actually signing any contracts, delivering any or taking any management decisions, and all of the authority to do that still sits within, in this case, Ireland. Perhaps then you may not have that permanent establishment. So independent agents, which we did discuss previously, could lead to a permanent establishment if they're truly independent, if they don't have the authority to conduct your business for you, if they don't have the authority to conclude contracts for you, then there's a good chance that there's no need to worry about them triggering the permanent establishment in the UK. So we talked about fixed. I talked about fixed places of business. Now, you may have a storage site that's there for fulfillment only, so storage and delivery. If there's no sales running through that, if it's not the the core business, it's just there to execute an order, but not actually necessarily take that order, then that may not lead to permanent establishment. I would say, to be safe, if you have any kind of bricks and mortar leased or owned in the UK, then get in touch with an advisor to understand whether that will constitute a permanent establishment. But it doesn't necessarily, just because you're storing stuff in the UK, doesn't mean you have a permanent establishment necessarily. Hosted sites. So yeah, this is as I talked about at the beginning with the virtual PE risk. If you are hosting a website, an app, etc., on an Amazon Web Services server or something like that, then you probably don't have a permanent establishment. Traveling to the UK, so if management or if employees, contractors, etc., travel to the UK, it's worth discussing this because it obviously could trigger a permanent establishment, but it doesn't necessarily mean they are, just because you have boots on the ground temporarily and occasionally. And then, as also mentioned once or twice already, the construction projects, always check that, because some small projects, and perhaps not necessarily small projects, but the short-term projects may not lead to a permanent establishment in the UK. So why does this all matter? What are the implications for you if you have conducted business in the UK and it turns out that you didn't think you had a permanent establishment, but you do? The ramifications are quite significant. So the obvious one is that there may be tax that is underpaid in the UK, underdeclared, underpaid. You may not have factored that into your own cash flow as well, so that could cause you problems. Restatement of your financial accounts, because you need to keep separate books, keep the UK portion of the business separate from the Irish or any other part of the group. There could be potentially some material fines if the transgression is significant. Obviously, reputational risk. If that potentially is relevant, depending on your industry, where your customers are, etc. or even just for you as a business owner or decision maker within the business, potentially just internally, that reputational risk. There may be some implication for if you do have contractors, employees, anyone working in the UK under Irish contracts. It may be that if there should have been a UK entity and they were, but they're perhaps not necessarily, because they could still work for the Irish entity while on a UK payroll for the Irish business and work for the UK entity. But potentially there are some considerations there. Maybe there's some reporting requirements. Maybe there are immigration requirements or legal requirements from an employee's perspective and contracts, etc. So worth considering that. And then audit. So this excuse me, this point may well be just tax authority audits. It may be that you attract those audits because of the error from not declaring this permanent establishment. But also, if you're above the audit threshold in the UK, and audit thresholds in the UK are based not just on UK activity, but the global group. So if the group is over that threshold, even if the UK activity, if there's a permanent establishment, is not that significant, there still needs to be a statutory audit in the UK, and that is costly, as with any audit, including the tax authority audits. They will take up your time, which in itself is a cost to your business. And also the statutory audit in particular is not necessarily a cheap thing in the UK. So a fair few implications if you don't correctly identify that you have that permanent establishment in the UK. So just some red flags to sort of round this out. Then the main things that I would say is if you have any boots on the ground, whether that's employees, whether that's contractors, agents, even if third-party agents, it's worth considering what are they doing. Make sure you're really clear on their roles and responsibilities, and don't just leave it at that. Check every year or so, or at least every other year. Just what are they doing? Has the role changed? Have they inadvertently triggered a permanent establishment in the UK because of something they've done? So to always be mindful of anyone on the ground in the UK. What are they doing, and how might that impact the permanent establishment? Because you can go into the UK and set yourself up to avoid that. So it's good to know what triggers the permanent establishment. Fixed place of business, I mentioned earlier on, that's a real key one. So if you have any bricks and mortar or any management on the ground in the UK making decisions, then you probably have fixed place of business, and that is very likely, apart from a few exceptions, such as the storage and fulfillment centres, that is very likely to result in there being a permanent establishment in the UK. Construction, talked about that a little bit already. Where this really comes down to, or what this really comes down to, is how long is this going on for? What's the nature of the construction? Not just construction, but also installation and supervisory projects. What is the nature of the project? How long will it go on for? Does that trigger a permanent establishment? Definitely check that before you undertake any work of this nature in the UK. And finally, the point I made about servers before, not necessarily just servers, but that's probably the main one we might see, is if you have a significant digital presence in the UK, then there may be some implications, and there may be a permanent establishment that has been created as a result of pushing your core business through core UK business through a UK-based server, which is owned and operated by you. So consider your digital infrastructure carefully before going into the UK market. So that's a whistle-stop tour of permanent establishment risks in the UK. Very high level. I would pay particular attention to the risks with the implications at the back of your mind, but the red flags that we covered at the end, if you see any of those, then I would definitely get in touch with your Enterprise Ireland account manager, ask them to put you in touch with us, or feel free to reach out on the email here on screen. It's a risk you don't want to take, so a free conversation could save you a lot of headache in the long run. Thank you very much for listening.